Today, you're going to step into the role as a front-end developer for the very first time and create this right here, this project, using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Hey everyone, what's up? Gary Simon here. So today is a very big day. First, it's January 2nd of 2020, a new decade, and I'm redoing my 2019 front-end developer crash course, and this time we have it for 2020. So very exciting indeed, and basically this is going to assume, this crash course is assume that you have no knowledge of HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. Now, we're not going to be getting very much at all into JavaScript. At the very end, I'll get your feet wet a tad bit, but we are going to be focusing on, what the role of a front-end developer is and how you use HTML and CSS to make projects a reality in the browser and on your handheld devices using web technologies. And that's essentially what it's all about as a front-end developer. So I'm going to show you right here. This is the project again. This is something that I designed myself as a UI UX designer. And really, we're going to make it responsive, which means it adapts based on the device width that's viewing it. So this is like a mobile phone, this is more like a tablet, and then this is more like a desktop. So I'm going to show you exactly how to create this, and this is really what a role of a front-end developer is. So make sure to subscribe, because in 2020, I'm going to be doing a ton of awesome stuff in terms of UI, UX, and front-end development. And yeah, leave a comment if you like this, and let's get started. Before we begin, Linode makes it easy and affordable to host your website, your portfolio, your online store, and more on whatever technology stack you use. Getting up and running is fast and easy with one-click app installs like WordPress and Drupal. With back-end access to your server, customization and scaling options are all but limitless. If you just need something small like an online portfolio to showcase your work, Linode has you covered. If you need to manage tons of clients' websites and reliably serve them to millions of visitors, Linode can do that too. So sign up using the link below in the description to get $20 in credit on your new Linode account. All right, so the very first thing that you need to consider is which code editor you're going to use. Now, there's a lot of different code editors that you can use to write your code, your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, etc. But the one that I use personally, and a lot of other people use, and you can't go wrong with it, it's free, is Visual Studio Code. So if you go to code.visualstudio.com, this is the page you'll end up, and then you can download it right here. So download for Windows, assuming you're on Windows, or if you're on a different operating system, you could choose Mac OS, Linux as well. All right, so once you download that, make sure to install it, and then we'll go ahead and create our project folder. All right, so after you've installed Visual Studio Code, we want to create a folder for a project. So we're going to go ahead and open up your command line or your console. And in Windows, you do that just by hitting the Windows key and type in CMD and then enter. And we want to create a folder. All right, so I'm going to type in mkdir, as in make directory, and then the name of it. For this, we're just going to call this food. It's kind of like just a fictional food business. Hit enter, and it seems like nothing happened, but it did create the folder. And what we want to do is hop into that folder now, cd food. All right, so next up, we'll go ahead and launch Visual Studio Code from right here within the console in the current folder. So to do that, then you have to have Visual Studio Code installed already. Type in code and period. This will open up Visual Studio Code. All right, so this is the basic layout of Visual Studio Code, and I could create a whole course just on using Visual Studio Code as a code editor, but really at this point I just want you to be familiar with just a couple things. So over here there's kind of a taskbar or toolbar with different icons. You're pretty much typically going to be working within this first icon right here, and if you go ahead to search, this will allow you to search different areas of your files. Over here we have source control. We're not going to worry about that in this course. There's debugging, not going to worry about that either. And then there's also right here we have extensions or plugins. We are going to install one plugin, and we might as well just do that now. And that is the live server. You can see I already have it installed. If you just type in live server, you will have a green install button right here. You want to click that. Once it installs, it will reload Visual Studio Code, the app, automatically, and you will have live server enabled. I will tell you exactly what this does once we get to that point here pretty shortly. All right, so we want to go back to this tab right here, and we want to create a new file. So right here in this section is where all of your project files are going to be outlined. So we want to create a new index.html file. And we're specifically using index as the name for that HTML file because on modern web servers, if you upload it to like whatever.com, it's automatically going to look for a file called index.html by default. So we click that create new file icon, index.html, hit enter. All right, so what happened is it just opened up this index.html file tab. And you can see if I hit enter, we have all these lines that are created. So that's each line of your HTML file. All right, so let's go ahead and before I get to actually describing what HTML is, I want to back up just a tad bit and show you what we're going to be creating and talk about a little bit about that process and how a front-end developer fits into that process. All right, right here is an application called Adobe XD or Adobe Experience Design, and it's a UI design prototyping tool. And if you're a front-end developer and that is your sole job description and that's all you do, then you will never really mess around with this in terms of trying to design your own layouts. That's the job role of that is for a UI UX designer. What would generally happen for you as a front-end developer is a UI designer will hand you a mock-up of sorts like this or a prototype. In this case, it's a high fidelity prototype because you can see everything is exactly outlined as we want it to look like in a browser or on a device of some sort. And for this application, you can actually create different prototypes where they can animate and you can see how they're all connected. And if I hit play, for instance, right here, you can see we have this interesting animation that comes in as perhaps the UI UX team would want you to implement. Your job as a front-end developer is to take this and make it a reality on all devices and make sure it works on all devices. You can also see over here we have sort of a mobile view of the same layout. So typically in a real serious project, you would have a design for each type of device that's out there. So for here we have an iPhone XR XX Max sort of appearance. We also have a desktop, but really you might have several other device widths and viewport widths as they're called, like maybe for tablets. In that way it will instruct you as the front-end developer about exactly what the design and how the layout should behave across all of these devices. All right, so we'll get into that when we get into responsive design with CSS. So this is our goal. We want to make this thing a reality through HTML and CSS. Now, there's also something that you should be very familiar with or become familiar with, and that is what's called mobile first design. All right, so the idea is when you're a front-end developer and you're writing out your HTML and your CSS, you want to make sure you're operating under the mentality of mobile first. All right, so just to boil it down very simply, when we go to create our HTML and especially the CSS, we want to look at in the browser as we're working and developing with the help of that plugin that we installed, the live server plugin. We want to make sure that we get it looking right on mobile first. So that means when we're looking at it in the browser, we're going to situate the browser in such a way that it looks like it's on an actual mobile device width. All right, and then we will progressively enhance it and we will then make it work for tablets and then also make it work and look well and look good for desktops ultimately. All right, so I want you to start thinking about this layout in terms of blocks. Everything here is a block or a container of some sort. So if I get out this tool, you don't have to follow along even if you don't have this app. I just kind of want to demonstrate what I'm talking about. This right here, let's just make this something that really sticks out quite well. We'll make this larger. This is a block. So that piece of text, the logo, that's a block. All right. This is a block. This is a block. That's a block. And in a whole, we can see how this whole blue section at the top, how it contains all of this text, that's a block as well. And so when you're writing your HTML, then you have to think about all these elements as being blocks that have to be defined through HTML elements. So let's go ahead back to our code editor, Visual Studio Code. And here's our index.html file. So one side note, it would be helpful if you can get to the point where you can have 2 monitors or one of those ultra wide monitors, because it's very handy to be able to see while you're working in your code the actual mock-up when you're writing out your HTML and CSS. So you could situate it and structure it in such a way, your windows, to where perhaps your code editor is taking up most of the space right here, and then your mock-up, depending on which application they chose to use, there's more than just Adobe XD and Figma and all that. We could even just do this. Let's take this right here. That way we can kind of see what the design looks like, and then I can just drag this down, and there we go. So I suggest doing that the same way if you just have a single monitor to work on, and then that way you kind of see the type of HTML elements that you're going to have to create in order to make this necessary. So first of all, kind of getting ahead of myself, what exactly is HTML in and of itself? HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It is the standard markup language for building layouts and websites. You build out HTML elements and their attributes, which serve as the structure or the skeleton of your layouts. So HTML without CSS, though, is usually quite ugly, but it's required. So you can't have flesh without the bones, and you'll see what exactly I mean as we proceed. So now that you know what HTML is, we're going to start by, here in Visual Studio Code, hitting Shift and the exclamation point to create an exclamation point. And you can see it says right here, emit abbreviation. So in Visual Studio Code, we have what are called emit abbreviations, and really it's a good idea to use them as much as possible, because what it helps you do is it creates boilerplate HTML, and it makes your life easier so you don't have to create all HTML from scratch. So if I click on it, let me hit Control B to get rid of that sidebar so we can see everything that's happening here. We can see that this is what it created for us. If we had to type all this by default, it would have taken quite a while. But this is just your basic starting point for your HTML document. So the very first line, you can see here, it says doc type HTML. And this always has to be the very first line when you're declaring your HTML. And so basically it's just instructing the browser that this is an HTML document. Next up, we have our first actual tag, which is the HTML tag. Now notice the HTML tag opens up with a little less than sign, and then you have the element name. In this case, it's HTML. For the HTML element, you're only going to have one of those, and you really never have to mess around with it. So basically everything else is nested inside of the HTML element, because the HTML element closes at the very end. So that will always be your very last line in your HTML document. All right. Next up, you have 2 very important HTML elements that are nested inside of the HTML element right here. And that is your head. As you can see, the head tag opens up right here and closes. So we have other HTML elements inside of the head tag. And then also we have body. We have the body tag, and it's just empty right here. So first, before we get to the body, which is where we're going to be working at for the most part, let's talk about the head element and exactly what the purpose of the head element is. The HTML head element contains various HTML elements inside of it. These elements contain data about the HTML document itself. So these include information about the page title, which shows up at the top of the browser, character sets, CSS styles, scripts, and other information. So most of your work does not usually take place in the head element. Okay, so now that you know what the head element is and what essentially its purpose is for, we're going to add an element in here before we get to the body section. And so the HTML element that we want to add is called link. And again, we see an Emmet abbreviation show up here in Visual Studio Code when we just type the name link. And then this is the one that we want to use, just link right here. And you can see it says link rel equals style sheet, because we're going to be attaching a CSS document to this HTML element. And this is for the future, because we're not going to write any CSS yet. We first want to write all of our HTML first. So the href is basically saying, where is the location of the CSS file? All right, so we're going to say CSS /. So that means we're going to store it inside of a folder. And inside of that folder, we're going to call it main.css. So we'll save this. And again, we're not going to be writing, if I hit Control B to get out the sidebar, we're not going to be writing any CSS yet, because the HTML comes first. The HTML is the skeleton. And then once we have that skeleton, we can start writing the CSS. But for now, I just want to get this linked up so we get it out of the way. And we can also create that folder. So if we click the new folder icon called CSS, hit enter, and then create with the CSS folder selected already, a new file inside of it called main.css. So now these two files are linked together. The index.html knows that it needs to look for the main.css file for any of the CSS stylings. So we'll come back to CSS once we've got all the HTML ready. So I'm going to hit Control B to get rid of that sidebar. And the body tag. The body tag is basically where you're going to spend 95% of your time as a front-end developer when you're working with HTML. All of your tags will go here inside of this inside of the body tag, essentially. So if I save this, hit Control B to get out the sidebar, make sure you have that live server plugin installed. This is when we're going to use it. I'm going to right click and choose Open with Live Server. So when we do that, it opens up a web browser, whichever your default web browser is. In my case, this is Google Chrome. And we can see it says at 127.0.0.1:5500. Yours will probably say 5500. But basically, this is just a temporary little web server for you to look at what your project's going to look like in the browser. All right, so notice it says index.html as well. So it's looking for that file specifically. So as you can see, it is completely blank because we have no HTML elements inside of the body tag. So this whole white area right here only renders what is inside this body tag. So if I just, let me close these out. If I just type in some characters here and hit save, it's going to show ASD, whatever I typed right here. All right, so that's a very important concept. That's for a beginner to understand, that all of your stuff that you write in here in your HTML document is primarily going to be within the body tags. Now, before we actually begin writing HTML, because this is a crash course, meaning we're not going to cover every single thing that has to do with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, that would be a million hours long, I wanted to point out the w3schools.com/HTML website, where if you really, and if you're really interested in front-end development and learning HTML, you should definitely check out this resource for you, because it tells you all about HTML here, the introduction, HTML elements, which we'll talk about, attributes, but I'm not going to be going over every single thing that you see here. So I just wanted to let you know, of course, there's a ton of other resources from which you can learn all about more in-depth in terms of HTML. But what I am going to teach you here will allow you to create, obviously, the project that we're going to create. But again, you're probably going to walk away from this little crash course, quite, disoriented, because I'm giving you so much information. So if it is something that you like, definitely check this resource out and others. Okay, so we have our blank document here, and we want to get to this right here. All right, how do we start? How do we even begin thinking about this? All right, so like I said before, a little bit ago, think of everything in terms of blocks. All right, if we're looking at this high fidelity mockup, what would be the first block that we should start in with our HTML to help define the skeleton structure of this layout? So what I would say the very first element is actually this photograph that we see over here. So if I expand this just a bit, we'll see we have this large photograph. And this is really the first element that we should consider. It's this entire block as outlined in this section right here, okay? So let's create the HTML element for that, all right? So which element would we use? Now there's, in terms of HTML, everything are HTML elements, and there's a ton of them. And I'm not going to cover them all, but for this particular element, I'm going to just use what's called a div. Now a div is arguably one of the most common HTML elements out there. And it really is just a way to define a section or an area of your layout, if that makes sense. So to get started, let's go back here. I'm going to get this into view, by the way. So we want to set this up, by the way, before we start so that we can see what it looks like on a mobile first view. So this right here would be more of like a desktop, right? This might be a tablet. There's a couple of different ways to do this, by the way. So you can do this on Chrome or Firefox. If you hit Control-Shift-I, we'll see this DevTools section come up. And if we click on this element, Toggle Device Toolbar, we can see it's showing us what this HTML document looks like on an iPhone X, or we could change it to something else like an iPad. And so this is one great way to see what it will look like on specific devices, but you don't necessarily have to use this device toolbar or preview. You can just take the edge of the browser and just kind of get it into a rough phone shape like this, if that makes sense. So we want to create that first block, which has that the image inside of it, which is kind of like the oranges, and it's a blue, and also all of the other content that is inside, that's sitting on top of that image. So again, going back to our document here, I'm talking about all this content right here, like the logo, the headlines, and then the little description, and even this whole form right here. So let's create that. So we create our HTML div tag or div element. We can just type in div like that if we want and hit enter here in Visual Studio Code. Or we could, if it has what's called a class attached to it, and this is another Emmet abbreviation, we can type in period and then the name of the class, Hero BG. So when we do that and hit enter, this is the code it provides us. So you're probably wondering, what is class equals and then this Hero BG? All right, so this class here is called an attribute. Now, most HTML elements are able to have attributes on them, certainly for one called class. And you add them just with inside of the greater and the less than and greater than signs. And then you have your first is the element name or the tag name. This is div. And then you can put your attributes. So this is an attribute, and the attribute happens to be class. And then it says equals. And then inside of here, we have in quotation marks the name of the class. I'm choosing to name it Hero-BG. And I'm choosing to name it that because BG is just short for background. And then Hero, sometimes the top portion of a website is referred to as like the Hero section. So you're probably wondering, what's the purpose of that though? What is the purpose of this class? Well, when we get into CSS, I'm going to use CSS to reference this div element, and I will place in that background image and also do some other stylings. So you will see classes all the time. And of course, there's a lot of other attributes, but for now, we're just going to leave it at our class, and then we'll tackle them as they come on through. So now we've defined a block right here. And if I hit save, and of course, I got rid of that text here, it's still invisible. We don't see anything. Now, if I bring out this browser and hit Control-Shift-I to get out the DevTools once again, we click on Elements, and let me drag this down. We can see all the HTML that the browser sees right here. And if we hover over certain areas, certain HTML elements and tags, we'll see that certain things happen over here. So we can see our body tag, and then we have our div class Hero. Now, it's not shown because by default, divs, the browser doesn't style it in any way that you can see it. It's just kind of an empty thing until you actually use CSS to give it some sort of style, like giving it a background and giving it a height. So I just wanted to outline that and let you know that you can actually use the dev tools and Control-Shift-I and to see what's happening in relation to where you're hovering at over here. And it can really help you. And also you can actually write CSS in here, down here, but we'll get to that later on. All right, so next up, we have to refer back to our high fidelity mockup. Let me close this and we'll go back to our mockup. Here I'm using Adobe XD. And let's see what we have going here. So next up, we see we have this Yummy Eats. This is a logo, all right? Most websites and landing pages are gonna have a logo that you have to create. So what I'm going to do is, before we tackle the logo, I'm going to use a semantic element, a semantic HTML element as they're called, and we're going to define everything here inside of a section. And there's a section tag. So I'm going to type in section, and we're going to have two sections. So if you look at our mockup here, we have two sections if you look at this design as a whole. So we have this section up here, and then we have another section down here. So I'm going to define both of those inside of two sections. And later on down the line, when I get to the CSS, I want to be able to style each section a little bit differently from each other. So I'm going to give it a class. So the class of this, I'm just going to call this top. Again, you can name these pretty much anything that you want. All right. And again, we will have another section. So I'm just going to hit section, hit enter down beneath, and I'll just leave that empty for now. And again, if we save it, we still see nothing because we haven't styled these at all. All right. So after that, we're going to tackle that header section with the logo. Now, another semantic element would be another HTML element called header. All right, so inside your header, you typically find two things. You find the branding or the logo, and you also find like a menu or navigation. I'm choosing to leave the menu navigation out, so we're just going to have a logo here. So I'm going to put in the logo. Sometimes if the logo is an image, you'll use an image tag, but this is just a type-based logo. So we just want it clickable though. So if people click on it, it'll take them back to the home page. So the way you do that, if you ever want a link as it's called, you use the A tag. So hit A, enter, and then href equals, very similar to up here to this attribute. This is an attribute. We don't have anywhere for them to go, so I'm just going to put in a hashtag, and that'll take them just wherever the current page is. It won't really do anything. Then we're going to put in Yummy Eats. All right, so this right here is the anchor text. This will show up in the link. Now, if I save this now, we're going to see that. We're going to see the classic blue underlined link. If you click on it, it doesn't take them anywhere, as you can see. All right, so now we actually have our first element that's visible that we can see on this design. Very exciting stuff, isn't it? So now we have to ask ourselves, what's next? All right. You know, like I mentioned before, if you wanted to have a navigation of some sort, hit Control B, get rid of that sidebar. We would normally use a semantic tag called nav, UL for unordered list, and then inside of the unordered list, we'd have LI, which is a list item. We'd have an A for a tag, which is clickable. And then we'd have like home, and then we do like about, services, you know, whatever navigation you want your website to have. Of course, it looks really ugly right now because there's no styling, but I just wanted to point it out that that is usually the pattern for where you would have a navigation, but I'm going to delete all that. So now, what we're going to do is ask ourselves, what is next? Reading from top to left, from top to bottom, left to right. So we got our Yummy Eats. We already have that element created for the skeleton version. It doesn't look like this yet because we haven't got to the CSS. Next element looks like this, right? The healthy eating experience, which is basically the headline of this website. And that's a very common element as well that you'll find in most website designs and apps and all that. So we have a headline here. So let's go ahead and create that. So we need to create the HTML for that. And when it comes to type-based elements like this, like text that people read, there are several different types of tags to use depending on the context and what you're trying, what the text is and what it's doing in the design. For us, this is a headline, so we use what's called a heading tag, and there's 6 of them. And usually it's order of importance. So H1 is really designated for being the most important element on your page, and usually that's a heading or like an article title or something like that. So we hit H1, and then we're going to put in the healthy eating experience. The healthy eating experience, right? So if we save this, we can see our heading right here. Now, there's one thing that's a little tricky here. If I go over to our prototype, we'll see it says the healthy, and it's styled differently. It's all uppercase. It has this little blue element, like a little underline, like offset right here. And it just looks quite a bit different from this text, right? Well, that's the job of CSS. And in order to let the CSS know, once we get to that point, that this should be styled differently than this text, we're going to put in a certain HTML tag just around the healthy. And a good tag for that is span. So if I put in span and we open it up right here, and then we end it around the other text, we can save, nothing changes, but now we're going to have access through CSS to say span, we want to give this a certain rule set. So you'll see and you'll understand how that works as we go through. And in fact, if I get out once again the dev tools with Control-Shift-I, and we use this little clicky thing, this icon right here will allow you to just click on something and it'll take you right there, because once the HTML, we come across a lot of tags, it's a little bit difficult to find things otherwise. So we could see our H1 element, and you can see this little arrow next to it. If we toggle that down, we'll see it says the span, there's that block. That block that we can now, or later on in CSS, we can target that specifically and make the necessary adjustments through CSS properties and values to make it interesting looking and more like it does on that prototype. So what's next after this? So next up after this, we have a paragraph right here. Paragraph is very simple. We're just going to stay under here, underneath the H1 and outside of it, P, and that's it. It's just a simple P tag or a paragraph tag. And inside of here is where your text goes. So there's another plugin that you can get called Lorem Ipsum, and it's just basically Latin filler. And so you'll see this sometimes in prototypes that UI UX designers create. You'll see Lorem Ipsum text. It looks like this strange text, and you don't understand what it is or what it means, but it just means they didn't have the ad copy at the time, like the real ad copy, so we're just going to put this in there instead. So you can actually get a plugin called Lorem Ipsum in the extensions, and it'll allow you to type something like lorem and then how many characters or words you want to have. So if lorem 20 will give us, if I hit enter, that will give us 20 characters of this just random Lorem Ipsum text. All right. So next up, if we save it, by the way, you'll see it right here. So this is what our design looks like so far. Without CSS, it looks nothing like our prototype, and that's expected. So now, what's up after this? So if we come over to our XD document, we'll see we have this container right here. Now, of course, if we don't hover over it and I don't select it in Adobe XD, it's just this block, and that's what we want. So we have to create the HTML markup for that, and then all the stuff inside of it, like the form. So to create that element, we could use a div tag. All right, so again, we used a div tag once already. We're going to use another one for that form container, the white section, and then all the stuff inside of it. So form, so remember, you create a class, a div class, by just typing in period, and then the name of the class that you want to name it, something that makes sense. So we'll just say form container. Hit enter, and then we'll hit enter again, and then we can start writing our HTML inside of it. All right, again, if we save it, we don't see anything because remember, it's empty div tag. Therefore, there's no styling applied to it because we haven't done any in CSS. So next up, this whole thing over here is a form, right? This is a form element. We have a label, we have a text area where people will be able to type in things like a city, and then a form button. So we want to wrap everything inside of a form element. So I'm going to type in form. And action equals, basically that means where are we going to submit the form information? Like when the user's filled out the city, where is it going to go? For the purpose of this crash course, we're not going to worry about the action or submitting it because that goes outside of our scope as a front-end developer usually. So all we're going to do is just open this form up, and then inside of it, we're going to put in two different things. And this is where it can kind of get tricky, but initially I'm not going to cover the tricky part, but we will eventually, simply because we have to make sure everything lines up and works for the desktop and not just the mobile version as well. So we have our label. That's the next thing that we're going to put. So if we get out here, it's just this label. Now, when it comes to form elements, we don't want to use a paragraph. We have an actual tag that we use for it called label. So hit label, and we have an attribute called for. And by the way, if you hover over these, it's going to tell you, it's going to give you, the Visual Studio Code will give you information about, what this is. So just to describe what it is though, when you have every label on a form element is in reference to some sort of form control or input. In this case, it's a text field that people put a city in, right? So we just have to designate, which label this is in reference to or which input. So we're going to call it city. And then inside of label, actually outside of label, because sometimes you can put in the input, the next element inside. I'm choosing not to. We're going to put in the actual input text field. So if I type in input, hit enter, we see it says type equals text. This attribute of type allows you to specify a whole different types of input fields, like a text area, for instance, which is like a bigger, larger, multi-line text field. For us, we just want input type equals text. And it's also, you usually want to put in a name attribute. So we're going to give it a name of city as well, and an ID of city. The ID name right here is in what this for value is in reference to. All right. So if you name this city 3 or city 4 or whatever, this one should be named city 3 or 4. So let's hit save right here and see what's happened so far. And right now our label, I forgot rather, to put in the actual label, which is enter your city. So let's save that. And we can see it says enter your city. So I can now type into this, my city, like you just saw here, Warren. That's where I live, Warren. Now, of course, it looks nothing at all like what we have here, right? Again, that's the magic of CSS once we get to that part. So you can see also it says example San Diego. Let's go ahead and put that in. So we're just going to use a paragraph for that. Example San Diego. All right, we'll save that. We'll see it shows up right there. And then after that, we're going to put in a button. All right, so we'll say input. This time, the type is a button. We can click on it right there. And then the value is what the text inside of the button is. In our case, it's find food now right there. So we're just going to type in find food now. There's our button. So as you can see, for some HTML elements, the browser will style it. It doesn't just look like text, obviously. It knows this is a button, so it's going to make it look like a button. But with CSS, we can change it to look like anything practically, especially this button, this big old orange button right here. All right, so we'll save that. And just so I can get it out of the way, remember what I was just talking about, something that's kind of tricky? Well, if we look at our desktop version, or first if we look at this, we can see that everything is stacked on top of each other in their own rows. We have a 1, 2, 3, 4 different rows, and rows are vertical, columns are rows are horizontal and columns are vertical. But when we get over here you can see that enter your city and this text field and then this little text blip is on its own column. So there's two columns here. There's a column here with this content, and then this button is its own column. So we need to think about how to structure that stuff while we're looking at our HTML and we're looking at the mobile version. We have to think about the larger versions and the other iterations of the design so that we can properly mark up our HTML or create the right HTML elements and structure correctly. So as it stands right now, we have these 4 elements, but we need a way for the CSS to easily create 2 columns once we get to the desktop version in responsive design. I know I'm confusing you right now, but it's just the best way that I can think of describing it. But stick with me and you should have a pretty good idea. So what we want to do is wrap these 3 elements inside of its own div. All right, so I'll type in form left, so that creates a div class of the name form left, which we'll reference in CSS later. And we're going to close it and encase these elements right here. So if I just took all of them and hit tab to tab them in so it's easier to read. And there we go. Now in our form element, we have essentially 2 siblings or 2 children. Div class of form left and then input this button right here. So if I save it, it's not going to float them left and right of each other because we haven't yet structured that CSS. But once we get to that part in CSS for desktop responsive design, we'll be able to say, hey, take form left, push it over to the left, and then take this input button and push it over to the right. So hopefully you understand that at least a little bit at this point. All right, so we've already done most of the HTML, believe it or not. Just this tiny amount of stuff accounts for most of the HTML. Now the rest that we need to worry about, let's come back to our mobile version, is just this. So we have essentially what are just 2 elements. We have the heading and then we have a couple paragraphs. All right, so it's 3 elements really. So when we come down here, we can see all this crazy stuff, all these closing div tags. I know it's quite difficult to get a grip on exactly what's happening here. But that's usually what ends up happening. You know, once you start writing element by element, and then you take a step back and look at all the code, it can be a little bit overwhelming. But don't worry about that. I did screw something up though. We want to structure this a little bit differently. I put these section tags right here. Really, we want this to end entirely. And so we can see we have our div classes. Our very first div inside of our body tag, or our very first element, is a div of class of hero. And then it ends right here. If we look at our structure, our div class of hero background, which is really just this blue background with the ice and the oranges, it is this entire section right here. All right, so it ends right here in the HTML as well. So then we can start writing our other HTML outside of all of this last closing div tag, which is in relation, and you can see the line that Visual Studio Code shows. It goes straight up and points to this element right here. All right, so by the way, you can also collapse these if you hover over on next to the code, the line number. In that way, you can kind of condense things if you don't need to see them. So I'm going to expand it anyhow. And we're just going to come out right here. And again, by the way, you could put your HTML real close together. You could space it out. It's not a big deal. It'll still work. So I'm going to tab in here. And what we're going to do now is we're going to put in another section, like I mentioned before. This section is going to have a class as well. So section. And this time we could put a period and the class name, and that's an Emmet abbreviation, and it will allow us to negate having to type all that out by hand. So the name of this, I want it to be authentic, only because the ad copy was, I think it had authentic in the name. Yeah, authentic and wholesome. Okay, so this is our authentic section. All right, so inside of here, this is another one of those areas where when you're trying to figure out your HTML structure, always look not just at your mobile design here. This is easy because everything's stacked on top of each other generally. because it's easier for people to use. But you want to look at your other variations that a UI UX developer designer has given you. So in our case, we have this desktop, and we can see if we come down here, while on this version, we just see this right here. I am going to include this at the bottom here, but I didn't have it on this exact demo, but it should be here at the bottom, like a picture at the bottom right there. They're stacked on top of each other, but on this version, we can see that there are two columns right here and right here. So we have to think about that. So how are we going to structure this HTML to accommodate that? Well, I'm going to put in first, because on the mobile version, we want the ad copy, or like where it says authentic and wholesome, we want that to be on top. So we're going to encase both of those, all those type-based elements inside of a single div wrapper, as it's called, or div element or div tag. And that will be, we're going to call that, we'll call this right call for column. All right. And then we're going to put in H2. Remember I mentioned if we put in H, you can see all the headers, H1 through 6. We already used H1. You can use H1 multiple times, but in terms of importance, this is not as important. We'll just put H2. And I'm going to put in authentic and awesome. Okay. Next up, we have our 2 paragraphs of text. I think I'm just going to use 1 paragraph though. I'm just going to copy that in off the side of the screen in my reference monitor. And it's just a paragraph. So hit P, enter, and then that lorem ipsum, probably about, I don't know, 20 characters. All right. And that's it for that section. So we have this element. So that's one of our columns. And then we have what's going to be an image of that bowl of food or something. So we're going to use an image tag this time. So image. And source, I'm going to hit Control B. We got our sidebar. We don't yet have it here, but this is the source of the image. Like, where is it located? We're going to say inside of an images folder, and it's going to be called food.jpg. And by the way, you can download the asset files and all the files for this, and they're all accessible as well in GitHub, so you can see all the code, and I think CodePen as well. So you can have access to these project files that we're going to be using. So this is the location of the actual folder, and I'm going to put in a new folder called images. So we're going to create that, and inside of images, we're going to put in the resource files. So go ahead and download that. It's a zip file, and you're going to see 2 of the food images that we have. And so put those inside of this images folder. Now, as you can see, here's those 2 images. We can just drag them right over on top of images, and that's one way to get them in there. Of course, there's other ways depending on your operating system and what you're used to. So there's those images. You can see it just showed up right over here. You can see it's really large, and we'll deal with that with CSS to get that more situated as it needs to be. If you're using an image, by the way, we can see that it has this alt tag right here, and that's just basically for accessibility purposes. You always want to have an alt tag with your images. All right, so the alt, I'm going to say this is just a picture of food in a bowl. Okay, there we go. That way, people who don't have, perhaps are using screen readers because they're blind, this will actually inform them through audio, through a voice audio, kind of like the Google Home or Alexa voice, what this actually is. All right. So you may be wondering, maybe not, but I'm going to mention it anyways. We have 2 images in here, right? I mean, we have this big image, which is a photograph of some food, but this is a photograph as well, but I didn't use an image tag for here. Why didn't I do that? Well, in this case, you can use CSS to reference photographs as well. And we haven't got yet to the CSS part, but I chose to make this a background because we have a bunch of stuff on top of it, all this type-based element, right? So it's generally easier just to use CSS to make it a background image as opposed to using an image tag in the HTML. Hopefully that makes sense. My dog's barking. Hopefully you can't hear that. Right here, this is just a standard image. and nothing's overlapping it, we can just use an image tag in HTML to show it. Okay, so that is it for the actual HTML. That's all that we need in order to create the skeleton, if you will, for this design right here in both the desktop version and this version. So all the magic and all the beautification comes into play when we get to the CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's what you use to style your HTML elements. You can control the layout structure, colors, typography, alignment, animations, and even more. And CSS consists of rule sets, selectors, properties, and values. And you'll see how all of this works in a second. Okay, so let's get to the CSS here. And you can see we're going to write all of our CSS in the main.css file. Now, here's the thing. You can actually write CSS inside of an HTML document. And it's worth just showing you this, even though we're not going to do it. And I'm going to tell you why we're not going to do it in a second. But you can write inside of the head section right here your CSS rule sets. And you probably don't even know what a CSS rule set it is, but don't worry, I'm going to show you and tell you in a second. But if you put in a style tag right here, you can actually write your CSS. All the CSS code that we're about to write here can go inside of these tags. But I'm choosing to put it in its own file because it just makes it much more organized to read. So we're separating these different concerns. This is our HTML document, so we're only going to leave HTML in there. And then for our CSS, we're going to put in our CSS inside of the CSS file. That's just to let you know. By the way, you can even put CSS specifically using a style tag on each of your HTML elements right here. So you can do that with style equals, and then you put your CSS property values like background, and then we say white or whatever. So you can actually do inline CSS as well. I thought that was worth mentioning. We're not going to do it though. So our CSS, like I mentioned, is going inside our main.css file. And of course, right now at this point, it's blank. So the first thing I want to do, or I like to do, is to import any custom fonts that we're going to be using. If you look at this, we can see that this font is a lot different than this font up here. This is that ugly Times New Roman font. It's a serif font. This right here is a sans serif font. It doesn't have all that extra stuff hanging off the end of the type and the letters and such. And this particular font, as you can see, is called Montserrat. A lot of my channel regulars know I just love Montserrat. I have it installed on my system, so that's what a lot of other people who watch my channel watch. I just like the font. So we need this font. We need to tell the CSS document that we want to use this font for our type. So you do that in your CSS file, although you can also do it in the HTML file, and I'll show you how. I'll show you both ways in a second. So we want to get our font up, and a great resource for fonts that you can use on your websites and your apps and such is fonts.google.com. Fonts.google. And there are tons of fonts that you can search from. So you can type something in like authentic, awesome, like we had before, or no, wholesome. What am I talking about? All right. And you can see a preview of each font right here. And these are all fonts you can use on your website. Now, I know the name of mine already, and that's Montserrat, the font that I want to use. So it shows up right here. I'm going to click this little plus icon and then come down here. It says one family selected. We'll click on that, and then we could see some options here. Now notice it says load time fast. Well, if I were to come over here to customize and add in these different weights, because each font has a certain amount of weights in terms of being thin or bold, or as well as being italicized. If we start adding in a bunch of these, you can see load time moderate. So each font, it takes time for the device to download, and that time, that depends on their connection speed. And, are they on like 3G or on their 5G or whatever, or on a cable connection? So load time, that means the more variations of your font and more weights that you add, the longer it takes. All right, so for me, I'm just going to have regular 400 and then bold 700. Usually the UI UX designer, they'll tell you which fonts you need to use. All right, so once you've customized it, Now we can import it either through the standard method, which this is the HTML method. So if we took this right here, we're not going to do this method, so you don't have to follow. We go back to our HTML document. Inside of the head tag, we can paste in that element right there. That means that this is one way that we can get our font ready for use. We're not going to do that just because I like kind of putting it through the import method, which is right here. If we click on this tab, we don't have to put this style. We don't have to include that because that would be if we were putting our HTML inside of the head option like I showed you earlier. We just need this import line right there. So we copy that, paste it in, and there we go. So now we have our font, and I'm going to come back here and put some lines, and our font's ready to be used. Now it's not going to change it just yet, because if we go back to our preview, which is not there, it is right here, you see it's still the other font, right? Well, we have to instruct the CSS to use this new font that we just imported. All right, so to do that, and it actually shows you right here, if we go back, it'll say specify in CSS. Font family. This is the property that we want to use, and we'll just copy it. We're going to type in the body tag. So here's our selector. It's the body element. And again, if we go back, we'll see we have body right here. So whenever you want to change your font that you're using on your website, you can do it at the body level because it'll affect all the type. So body, we open up here for the property declarations, and we're going to specify our first property that will allow us to change the font. And it gave it to us right here. I told you to copy it. The property name is font family, and the value is Montserrat, which is a relation to this imported font up here. And then the font family property, of course, it allows you to specify different fallbacks. If for whatever reason they can't download this, it'll just tell their system to use a sans serif font, which is a font that's more clean and it doesn't have the little things hanging off the side of the letters and such. So if we save this now, let's get this up before I save it so I can show you. Once I save, it is now using that new font. Very exciting, isn't it? So now we're getting one little step closer now to actually getting this thing looking more like our prototype. All right, so we can also see there's a little bit of white space going around this entire thing. So if I hit Control-Shift-I and I choose this little selector, we hover over certain elements. If we hover over body over here in the elements section, you can see this orange outline around the sides. And that's because by default, the browser has added a margin of 8 pixels around the body element. So this is something that you'll always encounter because of it's just a design choice that the browsers have made to add a little bit of margin or white space or negative space in UI in UX design, as it's called, around, and just to encase everything. So not everything is right up against the side of the browser because it looks not great. But for me, I'm going to choose to get rid of that entirely, and the way we'll do that is to put in the margin property and 0. Save it, and there we go. Everything is up against the browser. But of course, ours doesn't look like that in the prototype, but I simply want to be able to handle the browser padding myself. So that's why I'm resetting to 0. I do that on most projects in the body element, as we've seen, in the body rule set rather, as we've seen here. All right, so that's all I'm going to do for the body element. So next up, what is the first HTML element that we want to use? Well, we have div class of hero BG. Well, we might as well do that, right? The way we reference a class here in CSS, we notice that says div class right here. So we have to choose the selector. The selector here is called hero-bg, and it's a class. So whenever you're dealing with a selector that's based on a class, you put a period first and then the name. Oops, I thought I had that in my thing. No, I don't. Hero-bg is the name. Then we're going to open it up for our properties, and then here's where we're going to give our properties. So you always have to ask yourself, all right, now we have a role set ready to go in our CSS so that we can begin to style this div class hero section. And we can also refer back to our prototype to see, what changes should I make? All right, so again, The block here happens to be from here down to here at the very end. Well, we know we need to use that tag, the hero BG tag, to get in this image. So let's do that. We're going to use a background property in CSS. So background, and we'll say first, the background property is really flexible. There's a lot of background specific properties. For instance, if you knew you didn't want to use a background image, you could use instead background-color and then the name of the color. For us, we know that we want to use both an image and possibly a color as well. And so what I mean by that is you can specify in your CSS background property both a color and an image. So for us, just to show you, if we want to use just a flat color like this over here, let's go ahead. We can use this. Now, if you don't have Adobe XD and to follow on, that's okay. But this is going to give us the color code right here. So I'm going to copy that, and let's see here. Actually, I have a different color code that I used before that I know is the one that works, and it's right there. And then we're going to end with a semicolon, and we're going to save. As soon as I save that, we can see the background now is this color. But we also want an image. So to do that, we take off the hyphen color at the end, and we're going to put in URL right after our color value. And we're going to put in parentheses, and we're going to put in the location of that file. The location is inside of the images folder, and it's going to be called BG for background.jpg. So in order to get us there, because we're already inside a different folder, we have to hop out. So we put 2 periods and then a /, and then the name of the folder that we want to go into, which is images, and then the name of the file, which is bg.jpg. So if we save this, at this point we don't see it, but now we do. You can see it's like really big and large. We don't have to really worry about that in sizing it up yet, but we'll get to that once this container has been pushed down a little bit more once we start making changes. But all that matters is we know that image is there and it's going to work. Okay. So next up, let's go ahead and we're going to put in, let's see here. We do know all of the colors of the fonts and the type are white inside of this section right here, along with the logo. So we're just going to say color white. So color is the property you use to change type-based elements, such as paragraph elements and a bunch of others. That's the way you change their color. So notice it is now, after we saved it, everything here is white. All right. Now also, what else do we want to do? Well, we do notice on this version, all of the text is left aligned. Currently, it's all left aligned right on our browser. Inside of here, we want this all to be centered, essentially. So what we can do, there's another element we can use for CSS, and that is text align, text hyphen align, and then center. So now if we save this, it's all centered. So as you can see, things are starting to move along, even though they're still pretty far away. Now, we also notice, referring back to our prototype, that there seems to be a fair amount of white space between these elements, yet over here they're all kind of crunched up. There's also a lot of space like underneath this container and the button. Like a lot of things still look quite different, but we can add in some other property. We're going to do padding. So padding is like margin, which we've already discussed. Margin affects the outside of a element or a rule set or a container or whatever. And padding is the opposite. It affects inside of an element, the amount of white space. So I could put padding, and then we can put like 4EM. Don't worry, if you don't know what EM is, I'll let you know in a second. But you can see padding affects, it adds 4EM on all corners. So when we hover over our div class hero BG section over here in the HTML, you can see this green overlay. That's your padding. And so when you add just padding itself, it will add padding, like for 4EM, for instance, it adds it on the top, left, right, and bottom. If you only want it on a certain direction, though, you can put padding top, left, right, or bottom. You can see them all right here. So we're going to choose padding bottom, and I'm choosing a value of 4 with this EM unit. And so what this does, there's a lot of different units in CSS, and they fall into either two categories, as being either a absolute unit or absolute value, or a relative unit. So an absolute value would be like pixels, for instance. So you've probably heard of pixels before, but in terms of responsive design and how designs these days are very fluid, there's a lot of different sizes of devices that view your design, like from a phone to a big desktop. You want, whenever possible, you want to use relative units, and there's a bunch of different relative units. But for padding and margin, for the margin values, I recommend using the EM unit, and it's a flexible unit, as you'll see when we get into responsive design. So I'm just choosing 4EM for padding bottom. So you can see this is, if we hover over this now, you'll see that green area is just 4EM units right there. And you could play with this. I could do this like 20EM. You'll see that really push things down. So it's just a way to add white space or negative space or empty space to your designs. So for me, 4EM right here works pretty well. And that's really just in relation to the bottom or the inside of this part, because I want to be able to see some of this orange part right here. So let's continue on. Of course, we have a lot of stuff up here still to do as well. So let's also do our logo. So our logo is like up here, and it's looking purple and ugly. That's not what it's supposed to look like. It's supposed to look like this. All right. So let's get that going first of all. Now, if we look at the markup for this, the HTML markup as it's called, we have section class top, we have header, and then we have our actual logo. So the header, if we look up here, there's hardly any white space. It's right up against the top of the browser, but that's not what it's supposed to look like right here. This is the top of the device, and then it's down here. So we're going to reference our header element here. So we're going to say header, and we're going to put in padding again. So I'm going to put padding, and padding is shorthand property, because you can actually put in multiple values inside of your padding element, and it works like a clock. It's top, right, bottom, left. And so if I put in, for instance, 1EM and then 5EM, that means 1EM on the top, 5EM on the right, I don't know, 3EM on the bottom, and then like 10EM on the left. We'll see when we hover over this heading section right here, or the header section, how it affects the overall layout. We're not going to use this, but I wanted to let you know that you can actually do that. You can do that for margin as well. Now, what's really cool is there's a third way you can specify your padding and margin values. Let's say, for instance, I only want padding on the top and bottom. Well, I could put 1EM here, and then I know I want no padding on the right and left because it's centered anyways. I just put 0 there. So now it's created padding on the top and bottom of 1EM units. So now we've pushed it away, 1EM units on the top and bottom. Now what else? This looks pretty bad. It's like a purple, ugly default color. It's purple color that the browser gives links. Remember, it was like ahref right here. So let's overwrite that to make it look much better or more consistent with what it was in the prototype. So what we'll do is we'll put in, let's see, hero -bg a. Now this is a little strange because I'm referencing both a class and an HTML element selector together. Why would I do that? Why wouldn't I just put in a, which is right here? Because we can use, remember, we can use actual elements right here as selectors, like h1, p, section, div. So why would I just put this? Why wouldn't I just put A, for instance, right? Well, if I had multiple links somewhere else in here, then whatever change I make here will be made to every single instance of the A tag that's located throughout here. I don't really know. I don't think I have any other ones here, but I wanted to demonstrate the importance of this. I want to specify that I only want to change the information or any links, these elements that show up within this entire section right here. This entire section, Hero BG, is this dark blue color, right? So I want to make those links white. That's what the prototype has, right? This is white. This is a link. It's going to be white. So that's what we're going to do. So the way to do that is to say Hero BG, Hero BG class, and any of the links inside of there, or the HTML elements, in this case it's an A tag, we want to specify the following style. So hopefully that makes sense. We want the color to be white. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. I want you to see the changes that I make in real time here. So we want the color to be white, so you can see it change it to white. And by the way, in Visual Studio Code, if you hover over a color value right here, you can actually change with this handy little tool, so you don't have to sit there screwing around with different things. Notice I said white. You can choose there's a lot of CSS color values. You can do a Google search for what what all of them are. There's a lot of different ways to specify color in CSS. You can do an RGB function where you're specifying the red, white, and blue values. There's a bunch of other functions for getting CSS in here. You could do RGBA, to where you can also specify an alpha to make it transparent. But for now, we're just going to say white. What else do we want to do to make this look more like this? All right, well, it looks like this isn't bold, and this also has a text underline. This one doesn't. Let's fix that. So we can do text decoration, none. There goes our underline. We want to do font weight, bold. All right, so that's how you make the font, that's how you change the font weight up. You could also notice, remember when we imported the font, we said 400 and 700. These are weights as well, and we could have specified the bolder 700 right here instead of just saying bold. But it's smart enough to know that we're referring to the heavier weight that's included. All right, also, I want it to be a little bit larger. So font size, and then we're going to say 1.2, and we're going to use something similar to an M unit, but we're going to use what's called a rem unit for this. So for your text and your font sizes, it's better to use rem units, and this is all specific to responsive and flexible design. And then for your margin and padding, you want to use EM units or M units. Okay, so this is looking pretty good right here. I'm going to leave that, and now we're going to move on to our next part. Now, I'm going to back up just a tad bit. We did have a section element that we haven't adjusted, and there's one thing that I want to do for that. So if I go back here, we specify section. All right, and I'm going to put in here, we want to have margin on the left and right, because everything's right up against the browser. Remember, we took off that 8 pixels that the body tag gave. Well, what we're going to do is put in margin 0 and 1 EM. So 0 on the top and bottom, but on the right and left, we want 1 EM or 1 M units right here. So notice how it pushed it over. All right, very, very cool. All right, so now what is next? So let's reference our H1 element, because if we look at our HTML, we'll see we have after header, which we've already dealt with, we have our H1 element. Our H1 element is supposed to look like this in the browser. And you can see it doesn't really quite look like that just yet. So let's go ahead and specify H1. And we're going to say font size. We need to make this sucker bigger. So 2.5 rem units. All right, so remember, the healthy needs to be smaller, uppercase, and on its own line. All right, so before we get to that part, let's push this thing down a little bit, give it more white space with the use of margin. So margin. On the top, we want 2 EM units or so. On the right, we don't want any. But the bottom, we could say 2 EM units. that pushes it down this way, but I think it pushes it down a little bit too far. So to override this 2EM that's giving on the top and bottom, remember it's top, right, and then bottom right here. We'll put like 1.2 EM. There, so it came up just a little bit. Awesome. Now what about the span element? Remember, in our HTML markup, we have h1 span for the healthy. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, just in case I have any other span elements, I'm going to say h1 span. That means anything inside of span or h1 that has a span element, we're going to give this property or these CSS properties and values. So we're going to say first text transform uppercase. And by the way, you can put these properties in any order. So margin could be on top, up there, it doesn't matter. So we've made it uppercase because again, we need it to look like this, that right there with this little underline as well. We also need it to be display block. That means it's going to be on its own line. Nothing will float to the left or right of it. Next up, we need font size. We want it to be smaller because it looks definitely smaller in here compared to this type. So font size, I'm going to put in 1.5 rem units. There we go. That looks better. And we're also going to do, we're going to add a couple other things that aren't going to make sense in a second. What we want to do is add this little underline graphic. It's a custom graphic in order to get, yeah, right here. So this little blue section. In order to get that, we have to use a different rule set right here. So h1 span, we're going to put 2 colons right here. Now this is more intermediate CSS, so this is going to be confusing. Don't let it just discourage you. I just wanted to include a little bit of everything in here. We're going to say before. All right, there's an after and before that you can use on HTML elements. And it's just basically kind of like this empty area that you don't see here by default, but if you give it style, you can actually do interesting graphical things like an underline in that unique fashion. So our custom underline, the way we do this, we're going to put in a few necessary rule sets or properties that are going to be kind of confusing. Content is going to be empty. And we're going to have position absolute. In position absolute, you can add that to any element and it allows you to break outside of the traditional box model and you can situate things anywhere essentially. And we kind of need to do that with our underline because it's kind of behind an overlap or underlapping the healthy text up there. So position absolute. Width, we're going to do 3 EM. Again, that's another unit that you can use. The background color is this blue color right here, 00BFFF. And also our height is going to be 0.4 EM units. If I save this, we could see it right there right now. It's not exactly where we want it. Bottom, we're going to say is 0. Now it just disappears because it went to the very bottom of the browser. To fix that, we're going to set position relative right here. There it goes. So you have, this is kind of like one of those, I guess you could call ingredients or patterns that you can use whenever you're trying to position an absolute element, and you want it to be relative though to its parent container or to itself as a span element. So I know that sounds very confusing, but again, don't let it discourage you. Once you start working with this stuff enough, it'll all start to click. So also notice how the line, this underscore, is on top of the healthy when in here it's behind it. So what we can do, we have another property called z-index. I'm going to put 1 on here, and then this z-index, I'll just put -1, and there it goes. We could see it behind. But now we need to position a little bit because in our version over here, it's kind of off to the side. So let's go ahead and take, let's see here, a margin, and we could do margin hyphen left because we know that's the only, I know that that's the only value I want to use. -0.3 EM. So yes, you can do negative values with most CSS properties. So notice how it pushed it over. So I can make this big time like -3 EM, and it's going to be all the way over there. So it just allows you to position and create your graphics like that. All right, so that's it for that section. This is looking pretty good if we compare it, just this upper section, to this right here. Okay, so now let's continue on. What is the next part? Well, we have this, which is looking pretty decent. I think we're going to make a slight adjustment to it though. So it's this paragraph right here, but I only want it to affect this paragraph and not the paragraphs down here. So instead of just doing P and opening it up like this, we're going to do instead .hero bgp. All right, so it says this means any paragraph elements that's inside of this parent container right here. All right, so what we'll do for this is we're going to say font weight, we're going to make it bold. So notice now it's bold. All right, I'm also going to give it some margin because we need to push it around a little bit. So margin 0, because on the top it has good margin already, or padding, or right white space rather. On the right, let's see, we're going to say 1 EM and then 3 EM on the bottom to push this stuff down. All right, there we go. So on 1 EM, this is in reference to the left and the right, so it pushes away from the edge of the browser a bit. And then on the bottom, we're pushing this stuff down by 3 EM. So margin and padding is great for really situating and giving white space and negative space to your layout elements. So next up, we have our form container. See, it says div class form container. And that's right here. It contains all this stuff right there. So if we look at our design, we could see that our form container is white. So we need to give it a background value of white. So it's form container, and we're going to put in background -color white. There we go. We have quite a bit of work, obviously, although it's not a lot of work. CSS can drastically change the appearance quite easily. So background color, we're going to put in margin here. So we're going to put margin 2 EM at the top, and then on the right and left, we're going to put -1 EM, and then on the bottom, we're putting 0. So I want to talk about that -1 EM value. So when we didn't have this, we could see there's basically white space at the ends, or at the ends on the right and left. But in our example, we don't have that. It goes all the way up against the side of the browser, right? Well, the reason this exists is because it's container. There's a container here. Let me just show you, and let me find it. Inside of here, we have a section. And because this form container class is inside of here, then you can see that the margin of 1 EM on the right and left is affecting this. So it can't go all the way out, right? So this is a way, if we put in -1 EM on the right and left, it's going to actually push it out to that equal value of 1 EM. So now it makes it go all the way out to the right and left of the browser. All right, so next up, for our form container, we're also going to give it some padding. Look, there's no padding here at this form element or at the bottom of it. So padding, remember, affects the white space inside of an element. So padding 2 EM. So now things have been pushed off, but we have some work to do. So next up, we have our form element right here. We don't have to style that. That's not something that we're going to style. That's really just whenever you have input elements and such, it's a good idea to wrap them in form elements, although you don't necessarily have to. But we're going to work on, let's see here. I think we're going to have our form right here, our label. We don't have to worry about div class form left just yet, simply because that's going to come into play when we have to structure it to the left and the right and into the desktop resolutions. So label is what we're going to work on next. Our label, as shown in our prototype, is right here. And you can see it's this color. In fact, I can grab that color code real quick. So let's specify label. We're going to say color. I'm going to paste that value in. It's 2D7D98. And make sure to put that hashtag there. We'll save that. There it is. We're also going to do font weight bold. Let me close this out. So now it is bold. We're going to say display block because remember we don't want anything floating to the left or right of it. There we go. We're going to do margin bottom of 1 EM to push that text field away from it. And then also font size is going to be 1.2 EM units to make it a little bit bigger. By default, it's 1 EM unit, by the way, if you don't specify it. So next up, we have our input element. We have to make that input look like this, and it has rounded corners, and it's slightly bigger. So we're going to say input, and then we're going to put in something new you haven't seen before. There's different types of inputs, right? So we have an input right here of type text and input of type button. The way we can target this, you could specify class on this, by the way, like putting class equals whatever. But me, I'm just going to keep the HTML as minimal as possible, which is a good goal. And we're going to use a different type of selector. We put in the brackets, and we're going to put type equals the type we want, which is a type of text. Type is text, of course, is because this right here says type equals text. This will be type button. We'll get to that in a little bit. All right, so we'll save that, and we're going to make a few adjustments to this. So the first thing we're going to do is give it a custom border color that we have. So border, 1 pixel, solid. So border will add like literal borders around your elements. So it'll take multiple values as well. So first is like 1 pixels. Like how thick do you want your border to be? We're just going to say thin, so it's going to be 1 pixels, right? Next up, we're going to put the type of border. You can do dashed borders and just different types. You can Google all this stuff on your own. We want ours to be solid as it currently is. And then this is where we specify the color. So we could say gray, or we could do a hex color code value like we've been doing. Mine happens to be 707070, and we could get that value from here as well. All right. So if we save that, it's making it a little bit darker than what it was before by default. And we're going to put in now a width of 100%. And that pushes it all the way out. And we also are going to put in a padding. That's inside, so we're adding white space inside of it of 1 EM. And we're also going to do a border radius. Border radius is what will allow you to take these hard corners and make them a little bit rounded, as seen here. You can see it says 11 for a border radius in this design app. So border radius, we're going to put in a 0.5 EM. If you want it to be like 100% round, like pill shaped, you do 50%. Although, wait, I forgot about that. That's not quite what we would want to do. That's if you want to create circles or whatever. But if you did something like 3 EM, for instance, there you go. You have your pill shape. So you can experiment with the value. So 0.5 EM will work for us. I just want slight corners. And then margin top, we're going to push it away by about 1.2 EM. Oops. There we go. Okay. Next up, we have, let's see here, there's a paragraph, but it's white, right? So we need to see that. So let's go ahead and specify that. We have to look at the HTML. It's a P element inside of form left. So we're going to say, we'll just do form container, which is its other main parent. So form container P rather. We're going to say color is gray. All right. And it's right up against there. There's no white space, so it doesn't look right. So we're going to fix that. We're going to say, we'll just do margin hyphen bottom 1.5 EM. And then we'll do font weight is normal. And also font size is 0.9 EM. Just to make it a little bit smaller. And also, I think I screwed up one element here because this is not supposed to be so close. So what we can do is margin top 0.3 EM just to push it down a little bit more. Now, next up we have our button, Find Food Now. So we need to make it look like this. So let's just copy this real quick so we have this boilerplate here already typed out. We'll get rid of all this stuff. And this is going to be type button. All right, so for our button, we have quite a few properties to write out. First, we're going to change the background color, right? So background color will be F8 9104. And I got that code previously already, so I didn't know that offhand. So you can see it changed the color. Also, we're going to do border none. You see this emboss effect that the browser adds. So let's just make that none. We also are going to do width 100%. We're also going to give it a color of white. We're also going to make it font weight of bold. We're going to add a padding on the top and bottom of 1 EM, 0 on the right and left, of course. We're going to add a border radius of 0.5 as well. We are also going to change our font size to make it a bit larger, of 1.3 EM. And then also, we're going to do cursor pointer. I'm not going to save it yet. When you don't do that on the button element for HTML, you can see the cursor doesn't change like you would expect. So cursor pointer, save that. We can see now it's a little hand icon or pointer icon. Now, one thing that's a little bit off, notice how the width of this container, this input element, is further off than the width of this, and you don't want that. In order to fix that, the reason it's doing that is because whenever you add like padding onto an element along with the width, it will add 100%, for instance, plus 1 EM on the left, right. So you don't want that. It's making this extend further. That also will create for vertical or horizontal scroll bars. To fix that, this is just something you'll have to remember. We're going to use box sizing, border box. There we go. So if we save it, now it's all lined up. So that's just something you need to remember when you're trying to apply padding along with width as well. All right, so this is looking pretty good. All right, so now people are texting me left and right. What do we have next after that? I do want to show you an interaction-based design change. Sometimes when you hover over elements like buttons, they can change color or change some sort of property. I'm going to show you how to do that. We're going to take this, our button, because our button right here, our button rule set is what's controlling all of this. We're going to copy that and paste it, and we're going to get rid of all this stuff except for the background color, because that's the element that I want to change, the property that I want to change when somebody hovers over this. So right here, after that closing bracket, we're going to put hover. Then I'm going to hover over this, the value, the color value in Visual Studio Code, and change it maybe to slightly darker, maybe right around there. When you do that, it's going to change into RGB values, but that's okay. We'll hit save. Now we hover over it. Look at that. Very, very cool stuff. So you can change other properties too, like the font size or the font weight, like font weight, normal. See, look at that. So again, you don't want to go too crazy and make too many changes. All right. So next up, we're doing really well up here. One thing I want to do, we don't see our orange at all. Yet on here we do, right? We see the ice cube at least over here, a little bit of the orange. So we can actually come back up here, look at all this that we've written so far, and we can use, oops, that wasn't supposed to happen. We can use another background property called background position. And the position works on X and Y values. So you can position it vertically and horizontally. So we're going to put in, let's say 12%, and then also 83%. So these control the position of this background element. And look, we just made it show up. So you can experiment by like maybe making one 0. So this is X, this is Y. And so the way I got to this version right here, just experimenting with the color values before I started this tutorial when I was creating this project. So a lot of this is experimentation. And when you're first starting out, you're not going to know what CSS properties to use. So you're going to be Googling like crazy. I mean, that's how most people work, unless you're going crazy with courses where everybody's telling you, like me, in terms of what to use. But you still, no matter what, when you go to do your first project, you're going to be Googling like crazy. And that's okay. That's how you learn. Okay, so let's see what we have next. This is all looking pretty solid. I think just down here, we need to specify some rule sets. So let's see. After our button hover, we're going to reference our authentic class right here. So we're going to say authentic. And what we need to change about authentic, we're going to say margin 0. So we're kind of resetting a previous value up here. So what I mean is we on section, see how it said margin of 1 EM on the right and left? Well, this is a section class, so it affected that. But I'm choosing to set that margin to 0 just on this instance here. And the reason I'm doing that is because when let's show you the design here. There's going to be an image. It's not shown right here. It's right here in the browser. I want that to be right up against the edge of the browser. All right, just for you to see. And real quickly, we have some other rule sets to put here. I want to put my image or reference it, the image tag selector, and say width 100%, and that makes it a responsive image, or it responds. It's a fluid image in terms of its size. That way, get rid of that stupid scroll bar at the bottom, which completely got away now. So this isn't looking 100% like this, right? So we still have some work to do. So after authentic, we're going to have our right call right here. So right call, we can specify text align center. There we go. And we're going to give it some margin, 3 EM on the top and bottom, and 1 EM on the right and left. There we go. Now, next up, we're going to reference our H2 element. The way it's styled here, it's all uppercase. So text transform uppercase. And also, we're going to say position relative because also it has that little unique underscore right here. So we're going to basically reuse a lot of the values up here. If I can find it, there it is. We'll just copy this. So our H2 is right here. I'll just put it underneath. So what H2 span before. So if we save it, we're not going to see it yet. And that's because we need to make a couple adjustments. Oh, it's not a span. That's why. There, we can see it right there. I think actually that looks decent. I did have it longer. So the width we can make like 80 EM. There we go. And there we go, looking pretty good right there. All right, so next up, my paragraph. There's a paragraph right here. Look, notice the line height. This has a lot more line height, or leading as it's called, than this. So we can control that as well with the line height property. So if I just type in P, line height, we'll say like 1.2 or 1.3 EM. That really didn't change it much. How about 2 EM? There we go. Now I wanted to show you something really cool about CSS itself. CSS can have what are called custom properties. They're kind of like variables essentially. If you ever have values, the same values that are perhaps used in multiple areas of your rule sets in your properties, then you can create custom properties for this. So it's not necessarily it's not necessary in our instance, but I did just want to show you how to do it. So if we come back to the very top, I like to declare my my properties up at the top, and we can also add a comment. So we can just say custom properties. There you go. So that's how you create a comment. It's the / and then asterisk and then your name, and then you reverse it to end the comment. So I'll just say when you have your custom properties, you specify on the root selector, as it's called, and we're going to say -- which is allowing us, it's going to notify the browser that this is a custom property, and then name of the property. We're going to call it leading, or the line height. And then you put a colon, just as you would any other property, and then the value. We'll say 2em. So then, in order to use this custom property, we'll come back down to where we were working, and we'll say var, and then leading. There we go, it'll work. So now if you had this var leading as in multiple areas, instead of having, and you wanted to change it in the future, you would have to change, if this was 2em, and then you have another 2em up here and another 2em, you would have to change it all over the place in your code. But if you're using this var leading in those different areas, you only have to change it up here once. So if I wanted this to be 1em, there we go. They both are changed. 2em, there we go. All right, awesome, awesome stuff. So that is the mobile first design. That's pretty much all of the HTML elements that we are using. Although I think there was one that I missed, the H. Oh, I didn't miss it yet. I was lying. That's all we need for this part right here. So what we want to do now is slowly drag out the browser. And there's a certain point where this design starts to look ridiculous, and we've already passed it up. Like, this is way too wide. This right here, this button's way too wide. It just doesn't look good. This is very large. And so this is what responsive design is all about. And the reason I'm dragging out here is because I'm emulating what this layout looks like. This is a phone. This is an iPad, perhaps, or a tablet. And then we get to desktop. So we need it to look and just be a lot easier to use. And so that's our job as well as a front-end developer, is to deal with responsive design. So what we want to do is use media queries in order to do this. And so I'll show you a media query here. And it looks like this. We're going to say at media. We're going to put in parentheses minimum width, or min width. And this is where we put in, we'll say 730 pixels. So we open it up just like a normal rule set like that. So what this means is it's going to say, let me get out the DevTools so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. Control-Shift-I. When I get out the DevTools and I scale this in and out, you'll see the pixel count up here. We're only interested in the X value, the width value right here, the first value. Notice it says 520 pixels, and now we're going out. Here we're at 730 pixels. I say right here is where we should probably change the layout a little bit in some form. Maybe add more padding on the inside so these aren't so large. So we're at 730 pixels or so. And so anything that's above 730 pixels, there's also max width, by the way, but when you're doing mobile first, you just use min width. So anything above 730 pixels, you should use this code right here. All right, so what do we want to change? Well, I'm deciding to change the section rule set. So we have a section rule set already, and that is right here. So if we just copy this, paste it in, and put margin, instead of 1em on the right and left, because section, if you remember, is right here. And let me find up here. There we go. See, it has 1em on the right and left. I think we need to increase that for anything larger than 730 pixels. Let's change that to 4em. Now look how it pushed everything in. So now it is 4em. Now what's cool is when we go back less than 730, we'll see it goes away. And that is responsive design in a nutshell. You're overriding and progressively changing up and enhancing the layout based on the size of the screen. So let's go back to this, and we have one issue here. Remember we were using that negative value to extend it out? Well, we have to adjust that right now. So I'm just going to copy that code off the side of the screen. Form container, was it? And so instead of 1em like it was before, we're just changing this to 4em. And you don't have to include other properties that you're not overwriting. Only include the properties that you need to overwrite. And there we go. It's now fixed. You can't really tell it too much, but we are still pushing things in a little bit. So let's say at 930 pixels or so, like right around here, is where we want to make our layout start to look like this. This version. Let me go ahead and increase this. So now we have a little bit, some drastic work to do in order to try to make it look like this. So we're going to take this, copy it, paste that. We're going to put in 930 pixels. All right. And now one of the first things that I've noticed that we'll need to change is we don't want everything text aligned, centered. Right here, it's left aligned. So if we find the element, I believe it's hero BG, we can see it says text align center. Let's copy that, go here, and just get rid of these properties. Don't need that one. We're going to say left. So let's pull this out to 930 or more. There we go. All right. So also hero BG P paragraph, that's had some margin on it. So let's override that. We can just copy it from here. All right. And we can just change this. We're going to change this to the values of 0, 0, and then 3 EM. Font weight bold, we can keep that the same. That's not a big deal. So now these are all lining up as they should. So also our hero BG section. So we have a section element right here. We don't want the section going all the way out this far because in the right here, it's only going out like this much. It's like 65% or so. So what we can do is say hero BG section, and we can say width 65%. So now it's starting to look a little bit more like the actual mockup. So now we have some work here because look at what this currently looks like. Actually, it doesn't look that bad. But versus this, you can see it's not against the side of the browser. And it's also rounded corners and some other stuff is happening. So let's fix that. What we'll do is take our form container, which is that white element, and we are going to change first the margin. So the margin, we'll do 2 EM on the top and 0, 0 there. So now we've reset that margin so that on the top and bottom we have 2 EM and then 0, 0 right there. So then right here we're going to do padding as well. We're going to set padding of 2 EM. All right. We're going to do the border radius right here. 0.5 EM. So now it's rounded. And we're also going to add a box shadow because as you can see over here, it's like a shadow coming from here. We can add that with the box shadow property. So as you can see, there's a lot of CSS properties you've never heard of probably, especially if you're new, obviously. And this is kind of more of a complex sort of property because the values, there's a lot of different values. You have how far the X and Y, like how far out to the right and bottom it should be. The shadow should extend. So X is the first property. So we could do like 10 pixels. So on the X, so it's going to be pushed over from this way to the right a little bit and then down. And then you have your blur amount. We could do 10 pixels for that. And then you have an optional spread value. And then also the actual color of it. So RGBA, we want it to be like a normal shadow, 0, 0, 0. And then opacity, making it transparent like 0.3. So if we save this, there's our shadow. I think that's fine. We'll just leave it like that. Awesome stuff. So now there's something wrong though. We see that these are stacked on top of each other, but right here, they're not. They're actually floated left and right of each other, which I discussed that when we were setting up the HTML. So we have to do a little bit of work on that specifically. So what we're going to do, we're going to check out HTML. We have form. It's overall container for both of those columns, these two columns, this column and the button. So we're going to make it a flex box container. So we're going to say form display flex. So there's multiple ways to there's multiple values for the display property. One is flex, one is the grid. I'm going to show you both. So the flex box and the grid are two ways to organize your layout, and they both have different ways of going about achieving their layout. But for me, generally, if I'm just trying to do a simple sort of alignment, I'll use the flex box, and then I'll use CSS grid for bigger, larger elements and more complex things. What I ultimately suggest doing, because I'm not going to be describing the entire differences, is just going to Google and just typing in CSS Flexbox tutorial, CSS grid tutorial, also Flexbox versus the grid, and you'll just start to understand the differences. And again, this is a crash course, so I'm not going crazy with everything in terms of detail. So we've now made it a Flex container, and when we save that, it automatically floated those two child elements, those HTML elements, to the left and right of each other. But of course, this is all messed up now, so we need to fix that. This button's way too big for some reason, so we're gonna have to focus on fixing that stuff. So to do that, we're going to first take a look at our form left property, and it needs to be about 70% over here, not where it is currently. So we're gonna say form left width, and we'll give it a width of about 70%. All right, it's still not 70%, but once we fix the button, it will work. So sometimes confusing things like that can happen. Label, the margin, there was too much, so we're gonna set that to 0. There we go. Also, our input type of button, we need to fix that. Input type equals button. Let's get this up here so you can see it. So for our button, we're going to use height fit content, and that's going to kind of fix that large issue that we were having. And so again, a lot of this stuff, it just takes experience and just having done it before to understand how to fix certain things, because that one's kind of confusing as to why that's happening. So font size, but through experience, I know that that's one way you can fix it. So the font size, we're making this 1.1 EM. Let's move this stuff over. Oh, well, we can't really move it over because we have to have it large. Let's just go over here. That way you'll be able to see my changes. We'll do margin left. We're going to say 1 EM. We're going to move it away, so that gave it a little bit of space. We're going to do margin top 2.2 EM. And that's going to get it more in line with this button right here. And again, just trying to make it look like this element over there, or like the prototype does. Also padding, 0.7 EM on the top and bottom, and 0 on the right and left. And we're just trying to get it in line and be a good size. And then width 30%. Now it's pushed over. Awesome. So next up, we're going to have our hero BG paragraph element right here, because right now what's happening, there's so much space at the bottom, but if we choose it, there's a lot of there's margin bottom on there, so we need to reset that to 0. So hero -bg p margin bottom 0. Awesome. So now this is looking very similar to this section up here. So now we need to make this work though, because right now they're just floating on top of each other. So to do that, we're going to specify our section authentic. Now sometimes if you're dealing with a lot of classes and such, you can write first the property name and then or the HTML element or the tag name, which is section, period, and then the name of the class, which is authentic. That way, you know authentic is attached to a section. So it's just for organization purposes. So we could do display grid this time. And remember I mentioned the CSS grid is another way of trying to alter your layout and lay it out. We're going to do CSS grid. All right. So this the CSS grid, I have a tutorial already. I'm not going to go in depth into it, but the way you work with it primarily is grid template column. So you define your columns and rows as needed. We only need 2 columns. So we're going to say repeat to the same value of 50%. So look at that, but they're reversed, right? Because in our XD document, the bool's over here and the content's over to the right, but it's switched. The power of the grid is really cool because we can fix that. Grid template areas. We're going to hit enter and just come in. It's just a little bit easier to read usually. I'm going to type in bool in the quotes and also a space content. This allows us to name each of our 2 columns. I want to name one bool and the other content. So then we have to choose our siblings that are part of this. So we have right call, our class of right call, and also the image. Those will be our selectors. So I'm going to say right call, and then I have to name or assign this grid template area name to this this selector. So grid area, that's the property for doing that, and then just the name, content. Then our image, we'll say grid area is, and let me get this up here, bool. All right, so if I save this, guess what? They've just flipped as they were supposed to. Isn't that awesome? Because we have bool coming first. So the image we've named bold. All right, so we're not done just yet. Our right column, we're gonna add padding, 0. And this time we're gonna use percentage for the padding. That way we scale it up, it slowly increases the padding around. All right. And then also we're going to do, what else are we going to do? Text align left, because it was centered. Now it's left aligned. And we'll do align self center. Now this is another CSS grid property, and that means it'll be vertically aligned in the browser no matter how high this content gets. So you can't really tell what it did, but if this were higher, this would still be vertically aligned in this container right here. All right, so after that, let's see here. We have an H2 element, and for some reason, I chose to put margin 0 on it. That's this. So there was too much space or white space beneath there. All right, so now let's switch gears. So what's really cool now is we can see our design, what it looks like on a mobile device. And this is around a tablet or so. And then now we can see our responsive design has transitioned into something like this, which is pretty consistent with this section. So now I wanted to cover just very briefly the CSS rather animations. So what if we wanted this to animate in much or similar to the way it was animating in our prototype? Oops, wrong one. Let me get out the prototype section here. We hit play. See how this kind of animates in? Well, I'm going to make it all animated at the same time, but it's going to fade in and come down like it was here. So how would we do that? So if we go back to our index.html, we have to figure out what we want to animate. I want to just have everything right here, all this section, to animate in at the same time. So really, that's everything inside of this section element right here. So it has a class at top. So let's come down. Well, I come down at the very bottom outside of any of our media queries. I'm going to put in top animation, and we're going to put in animation, by the way, is one of those shorthand properties that allows you to specify multiple values. So first we put the name. Let's call it fade in. And then the duration, 2 seconds. And then I'll put forwards because we don't want it to keep looping. Forwards makes it so that it only plays once and stops. So then we have to define in the fade in animation. You do that through @keyframes, the name of the animation, fade in, and right here. So this accepts 2 different types of possible values. If you know you want to go from A to B, you could put from and to. All right. If you want multi-step animations, which we will do in a second, you can put 0, or you can put percentage values, and you can put multiple, not just 2 steps, but so you can have multiple sequenced animations. For this one, we just want a simple from and to. So then we could put in the properties that we want to change. So we're going to go from 0. So this is going to be hidden. This stuff's all going to be hidden at first. And we also want to go to opacity 1. So if we save, now it's fading in, but it's not coming down as well, right? So to do that, we're going to use another new property you haven't heard of, transform. And we're going to do translate Y, because we're going to come from the top. And then we're going to say -2em from the top. And then down just to its default position, which is 0. Look at that. Very, very, very cool stuff. So finally, we're going to get to the JavaScript portion. So we've done our HTML, we've done our CSS. Now I want to just get your feet wet with a little bit of JavaScript. Now, I debated even adding JavaScript in just because it's such a massive topic, but I decided to do it because JavaScript and front-end development are so intertwined. I wanted to at least do a tad bit of it. So JavaScript is something that you can use in conjunction with HTML and CSS to make your app or your website interactive in some way, shape, or form. So let's say, for instance, when a user clicks on Find Food Now, we want something to happen on that click. So they click the button, something's going to happen. Let's just say, for instance, we will have this big, we'll make the whole design dark. So everything will darken up. You'll still be able to see it, but not quite. And on top of it, inside of it, in the middle of the screen, it will say searching now or something like searching now for foods. And then we'll make it disappear after a couple seconds. How would we do that? Well, because it's interactive based on a click, we'll use JavaScript. All right. So just like with CSS, how we can link a JavaScript file, or we could write inline JavaScript, we could do the same thing with JavaScript. I meant CSS over here. We could do the same thing with JavaScript. I'm going to choose, just because we have so little code, to put the JavaScript inline. So we could put a script tag at the very bottom, just above the closing body tag. So this means anything inside of here has to be JavaScript within these script tags. All right. So the way JavaScript works is, but by the way, if you're interested in front-end development, watch multiple courses, read a lot about the basics of JavaScript, because I'm really not even going to get into the absolute basics. I'm just going to show you this one use case for JavaScript. So what we need to do is we need to create a couple of properties or variables that will allow us to access our button and also that little overlay that's going to make everything dark. So right here is our button. We're going to go ahead and give this an ID. So an ID is like a class, except an ID is unique. And IDs are generally what you use with JavaScript, although you can use classes as well. So ID CTA-BTN for a button, or call to action button. So what we'll do, we need to get we need to assign that. We need a way to get access to this button, right? So that we can know when somebody clicked on it or not. So what we're going to do is we're going to say let, and then the name of our button, BTN. And again, I'm naming this whatever. You can name it whatever you want. I'm going to name it button equals document dot get element by ID. Remember, we gave it an ID, so we're going to get the element by the ID. We open up in parentheses. We put in colon or our quotes or single quotes. It doesn't matter. And we can specify the name of that ID, which is CTA-button. So now this doesn't do anything. It just means we've assigned a variable. We created a variable called button, which means this right here. Just get this. Listen for something on it. And so that's what we need to do. We need to listen or add an event listener, as it's called. So what we do is type in btn, add event listener. Notice that little helper, I just hit enter so I don't have to type the whole thing in. And what we were listening for? We're listening for an event to take place, like click. There's a bunch of different types of events, like hovering mouse out, mouse in, mouse over, mouse out. There's a bunch of other ones. And so you can research that yourself. Then we put in a comma, and then we put in empty parentheses right here. You can usually pass in some properties if you need to. We don't need to. And then we use an arrow function and open it up inside these squiggly braces. what this is all right here is saying is basically if if somebody clicks on this button, then execute any of the code inside of here. Kind of like that media query sort of thing that we had over here, right? Like if the width of the device or the browser or the viewport, as it's called, is either 930 pixels or larger, then do something in here. This is the same concept, okay? Except this is not a width, it's just based on somebody clicking this button with the ID of CTA button. So now we need some HTML though, or we need to change something. And what we're gonna do, we're gonna add some HTML up here. So forget about the JavaScript for now. We're gonna do a little bit of HTML and CSS. So the HTML that we need to add is gonna be div, or actually rather just class overlay. And then I'm going to give it an ID as well. We could do this through abbreviations. I'll put a hashtag of overlay. So that's what it just created, a class of overlay, an ID of overlay. We'll use this ID overlay referenced in the JavaScript in a second. So this overlay, we're going to just basically blanket with CSS the entire document and make it dark. But inside of it, we're going to have an H3. It says searching now. So in and of itself, right now, this is all it's showing, this stupid thing. We don't want this showing anything by default. So, but really what we're going to do now is head on over to the CSS, and we're going to style this as we want it to look like. So we're going to go back here, and we're going to come up just above our first media query. There we go. And we're going to say overlay. That was the class we gave it. And we're going to do position absolute. That'll allow us to break out of the box model and just just overlay everything as we wish. So then we're going to do height. We want it to be 100% viewport height. Also, width will be 100%. And then background. We're going to use RGBA 000, and we're using RGBA because A is alpha. We could control the transparency, so we'll say 0.9. Now you can see, we could kind of see everything behind it, right? But not quite. Now also z-index, we're going to change to 1 because we don't want to see that other stuff on top of it. There, now it's hidden. This was showing up on top because the animation that we had applied to that section automatically made it overlay on top of our overlay, if that makes sense. So setting this to z-index 1 is the fix for that. We're going to do place content center, and we're doing that because we're actually going to make this display grid in order to just center that searching now text vertically and horizontally. It's a quick way of doing it, but we don't see it just yet. We're going to do color white. All right, so he says searching now. Now if I do display grid, there it is in the middle. So place content and display grid work with each other. All right, and now what we're going to do though, we don't want to see this whole thing by default, right? Right when the site loads up, it doesn't make sense to have this searching now. This only should show up when somebody clicks find now. So what we do instead of display grid is display none, and we're going to make it opacity 0. And you'll see why, because I'm also going to apply a CSS animation to it to fade it in from 0. So right now, we don't see it, right? Correct, we don't see that overlay. So now what we need to do is we need to go back to our JavaScript, and in our JavaScript, we're going to say, let's just replicate this line. So we select the line here in Visual Studio Code, Shift Alt and the down arrow key where we'll replicate it. That way it saves us some typing, because now we're going to create a property to access our overlay graphic up top, which is overlay. Remember the ID is overlay. All right, so once the button is clicked inside of here, we say overlay dot style dot display equals grid. What this is doing is it's changing the display, the CSS display property from none to grid once a person clicks on it. Make sense? Hopefully it does. So if we save this and I click on it, watch what happens. Nothing. Now usually when that happens, there could be an error in the console. There's no error. So I have to figure out what did I do wrong? So I'm going to leave this in here because that is quite frustrating because that should not be happening. So overlay, make sure everything is typed out correctly. Sometimes you'll misspell things. We have the ID of overlay up here. Up here, the display is none. Oh, but the opacity is 0. We need to wait and not put that in just yet. I could comment that out, the regular way to comment, but I'm just going to do that. And now if I refresh and I click find food, now it's going to show up. The reason it wasn't showing up because I had opacity 0. But we're going to leave opacity 0 because I want to, this seems jarring. When you click on it, it just shows up right away in your face. I would like it to fade in slowly. So let's leave opacity 0 back, in which case we won't see it, although it is overlaid because we can't really select anything anymore, but it's just opacity 0, so we can't see it anymore. So what we want to do is attach a different class onto it at the time of changing this display to grid, and it's going to be in an animation type class. So let me show you what I'm talking about. We're going to create a custom CSS class that is not found anywhere here. Like we won't find it here anywhere. But we're going to call it animate overlay. All right. And we want to apply just one property, and that's the animation property. Animation, we'll call it overlay, 3 seconds forwards. All right, because we don't want it to loop. Then we're going to go ahead, come down here, and specify our animation or keyframes for that property. So it's at keyframes, overlay. And we're not going to do from because I want to have a multi-step animation. I want it to fade in for a little bit and then stay there for a little bit longer and then fade out. So we'll do 0%. Opacity will be 0. Then 30%. Yep. The opacity will be 1. So then, and remember, this is playing over 3 seconds because that's how long we made the duration. From 30% to 70%, we're going to keep the opacity at 1. And then from 70% to 100%, we're going to make the opacity 0 to fade right back out. So we're not done yet because we have to then attach that CSS class that exists in this CSS file, that animate overlay class, which is right here. We want to attach it to our overlay element right here. So I'll show you what's happening in the browser though in order to do that. So what we want to do is say overlay dot class list dot add, and then we add the name of the class overlay, animate overlay. So let's save this and see if it works. It should fade in and then fade out. Ta-da! So if I show you in the DevTools, Control-Shift-I, what's happening here, when I click this, or if I come back out here and I click this, you'll see it automatically adds that animate overlay onto this element. Now, if this was our serious project, I would make it remove that element, and maybe you can challenge yourself to do that. Figure out how to remove a class, because like I said before, when you get into front-end development and you start doing your own projects, you're going to be Googling a ton about how to do things. So your task for this, you make this like an assignment for the fun of it. We know how to add a class, right? So after 3 seconds, how would you remove a class? So again, it's almost very obvious just based on add. And you'd also use something called set timeout in JavaScript, and that allows you to create code that executes after a certain amount of durations in milliseconds. So 3,000 milliseconds or 3 seconds, that's the length of that class. We could then remove this animate overlay or reset certain styles back to like display none. I think that's what you would want to do, because right now when somebody clicks on this, for instance, and it goes away, guess what? You can't click on it again. That's a bad UX issue, right? But anyhow, this isn't a serious project for this is just to teach the HTML and CSS. So hopefully you guys gained a lot out of this. So let's just check out the design one more time. This is our mobile design. Refresh. We can still see if we click on this will still work. Very cool. Normally you would be, when you're searching for something like this, it would be attached to a database where it's searching through. But again, that's kind of outside the scope of a front-end developer. But once we come out, our design changes up. Very, very cool stuff. All right, so hopefully you enjoyed that. Now, if you watched along and you really paid attention, I guarantee you're still probably gonna be a bit confused. I mean, you're not gonna go out and be able to create your own site from scratch and something that looks right. It just doesn't really work that way because there's so much new information that you took in. So a few suggestions, like I mentioned throughout the course, definitely watch other tutorials, my tutorials, and all the other YouTubers out there. And there's not just YouTube, there's a lot of written-based content. There's really cheap or free courses otherwise. There's so many ways to learn it. And really, I tell most people these days, don't go to college if you want to become a front-end developer. All this stuff is very cheap or even free online to learn yourself. All right, so if you enjoyed it, make sure, please, to subscribe, like it, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys very shortly. Goodbye.